It is just after 2 in the morning on June 30th, 1971. Out in the dark of the Kazakh steppe, a space capsule is coming home, and it is a perfect landing. The heat shield held, the parachutes opened right on time, the soft landing engines fired in the final second. Exactly as designed. Recovery helicopters are already circling overhead. This is supposed to be a triumph. Inside that capsule are 3 men who just shattered the world record for time in space. The rescue team lands, they run to the capsule, they knock on the side, there is no answer. So they open the hatch, and the 3 men are still sitting in their seats, strapped in, perfectly still. They look like they are asleep. They are not. Doctors climb inside and start CPR right there on the ground. But they are about half an hour too late. Here is the part that should not be possible. The spacecraft did everything right. Every system worked flawlessly from launch to landing. The machine was never the problem. There was not a scratch on it. Every reading was green. By every technical measure, this was a completely successful mission. The only thing that failed on this flight was keeping the people inside it alive. Their names are Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev. And out of everyone who has ever left this planet, they are the only 3 human beings who have ever died in space, not in the sky. In space. And the whole thing comes down to one loose valve and a line 168 kilometers above your head. This is their story. And they deserve to have it told properly. Here is the first thing almost nobody tells you. These 3 men were never supposed to be on that flight. They were the backup crew. The main crew was already famous. It was led by Alexei Leonov. And Leonov was not just any cosmonaut. 6 years earlier, he had become the first human ever to float freely in open space. He was a living legend. He flew with 2 others, Valery Kubasov and Pyotr Kolodin. This was going to be their mission. They had trained for it for months, and then everything changed. 3 days before launch, a routine chest X-ray showed a dark spot on Kubasov's lung. The doctors suspected tuberculosis, and the Soviet rules were strict. If one crew member was grounded, the whole crew was grounded with him. So 2 days before launch, the order came down, the prime crew was out, the backups were in, the 3 of them had trained as the second string. They were the crew that prepares for everything and expects to fly nothing, and almost overnight, they were walking to the launch pad. Now here is the cruelest detail of all. The spot on Kubasov's lung was not tuberculosis. It was an allergic reaction. There had never been anything wrong with him. The whole switch had been made for nothing. Alexei Leonov went on to live for almost 50 more years, and he carried that swap with him for the rest of his life. Because the flight that was taken from him is the exact flight that killed the men who replaced him. On June 6, 1971, they launched. The very next day, they did something no human crew had ever done. They docked with Salyut 1, the first space station in the history of the world, and they became its first crew. Salyut 1 had gone up a couple of months earlier, empty, just waiting for its first tenants. And another crew had already tried and failed. A few weeks before, the crew of Soyuz 10 reached the station but could not get a proper seal on the hatch. They never made it inside. They had to turn around and come home. So when Dobrovolsky's crew floated through that hatch, they were the first human beings ever to board a space station. It was the start of a whole new era. People were no longer just visiting space for a day or 2 in a tiny capsule. They were living there. And they did not just drop in. They stayed. For 23 days, they orbited the planet. They ran experiments. They grew plants. They tested what long stretches in space do to the human body. They watched the world turn beneath them. It set a brand new world record for the longest time any human had ever spent off the Earth. And down on the ground, an entire country was watching. Almost every evening, Soviet television carried live broadcasts straight from orbit. The 3 of them, floating and smiling, talking to the camera. They became household names, national heroes, live on air in real time. But 23 days of weightlessness punishes a body built for gravity. By the end, the crew was worn down and exhausted. They had pushed human endurance further than anyone before them, and they were finally ready to go home. After 23 days as the most famous men in their country, they were coming back as heroes. A celebration was already waiting for them on the ground. None of them would ever see it. On the evening of June 29th, they undocked from the station and turned for home. It was 28 minutes past 9 Moscow time. Everything went normally. The engines fired to slow them down and drop them out of orbit. And then it happened. 12 minutes and 3 seconds after that burn. At that exact moment, they were 168 kilometers up, still above the Kármán line, still technically in space. To come home, the spacecraft had to break apart into pieces. A set of explosive bolts was built to separate the modules. Those bolts were supposed to fire one after another, in a careful sequence, so the shock would be spread out over time. Instead, they all fired at the exact same instant, and that single violent jolt shook something loose. Deep underneath the crew's seat sat a small breathing valve. It had one job. It was meant to open only at the very end of the flight, low in the atmosphere. to let outside air in and equalize the cabin pressure before landing. The shock of those bolts popped it open early. It opened right here, in the vacuum of space, and the air inside the cabin started to pour out into nothing. And this is where the story becomes almost unbearable to look at closely, because we know exactly what happened next. Second by second, the three men were not wearing spacesuits. And there was a reason for that. The Soyuz capsule was tiny. There was simply no room for 3 men and 3 bulky pressure suits. So to fit a crew of 3, the suits had been left out completely, which meant that when that valve opened, there was nothing at all between their bodies and the vacuum. The only warning they got was a sound, a thin hiss of escaping air. Now, the crew was wired to medical sensors, and that telemetry survived, so we can actually read their heartbeats in their final moments. At the instant of separation, they were calm. Commander Dobrovolsky's pulse sat in the 70s and 80s. Patsayev was in the 90s. Volkov was the most tense of the 3 at around 120. Then the leak began, and within seconds the numbers spike. Dobrovolsky jumps to 114. Volkov climbs to 180. They knew something was very wrong. By around the 50th second, Patsayev's heart rate has crashed all the way down to 42. That is a body being starved of oxygen. And within about a minute, all 3 readings fall to 0. Later investigators studied the capsule and the positions of the bodies, and they found something unsettling. It suggests these men did not simply black out. It appears that 2 of them had unbuckled their harnesses, Dobrovolsky and Patsayev. They were reaching down toward the source of the leak, and we have to be very careful here. This is only what the physical evidence suggests. It is not something anyone will ever be able to prove, but that valve was hidden underneath the seats. Even if they understood exactly what was killing them, there was almost no way to reach it and shut it in the seconds they had. It looks like they understood, and it looks like they fought. And here is the detail that haunts me the most. From that point on, the spacecraft flew a flawless flight. With the crew already gone, the automatic systems carried out every step perfectly. The capsule turned itself for re-entry. The heat shield took the full fire of the atmosphere and held. The parachutes deployed right on schedule. The soft landing rockets fired in the final meter. A perfect descent, a perfect landing, all of it in complete silence, with 3 men sitting dead inside. Down on the ground, Mission Control kept calling out to them by their call sign. Yantar, Yantar. There was no reply. But that did not alarm anyone. Radio silence during the fireball of re-entry is completely normal, so nobody down there suspected a thing. As far as the whole Soviet space program knew in that moment, 3 national heroes were riding a perfect machine home to a hero's welcome. The machine never stopped working. It was only the people who had gone quiet. A state commission tore the flight apart, second by second. They pulled the telemetry, they tested the valve, they rebuilt the exact sequence of the bolts, and it all pointed to the same answer. The simultaneous firing of those bolts had jarred the breathing valve open, and in space, a cabin with an open valve empties out fast. The pressure dropped to a level no human body can survive in about 30 seconds. Within roughly 2 minutes, the cabin was close to a total vacuum. With no suits on, the crew never stood a chance. There was nothing they could have done in the time they had. The flight had been perfect. But the engineering on one small valve had not. And a whole country broke. These were not distant names on a list. The Soviet people had watched these 3 men every single night. Live from orbit, they had waved at the camera, they had been guests in the nation's living rooms, and then they were gone. Overnight, their bodies lay in state in Moscow. Enormous crowds filed past for hours to say goodbye to the heroes they'd only just been celebrating. A country that had been cheering a record was suddenly burying the men who set it. And this is the part that is easy to forget when we talk about space. We show the rockets and the records and the flags. We rarely show the cost. Every step off this planet has been paid for by people who understood the risk and went anyway. They were not reckless men. They were careful, trained professionals. Their mission had gone almost perfectly, and it still killed them in the space of a single minute, over something as small as a valve. That is how thin the line really is up there. So why does this story still matter, more than 50 years later? Because of everything it changed. The Soviet space program was so shaken that it grounded all crewed flights. For the next 27 months, nobody flew at all, and when the Soyuz finally launched again, it had been rebuilt around one hard rule. The capsule would now carry only 2 cosmonauts instead of 3, because they had to make room for something that would never be left out again: spacesuits. A new pressure suit was designed specifically for launch and landing, and that rule did not stay inside the Soviet Union. From that day on, every single human who has launched into space or come back down from it has worn a pressure suit for the ride. That includes the astronauts on the International Space Station right now, tonight. Every one of them straps into a sealed suit for launch and for landing, and they do it because of what happened to 3 men in 1971. Their deaths wrote a safety rule that has quietly protected everyone who has flown since. And there is one more thing their deaths settled. It is the reason we can say this with no exaggeration at all. They are the only 3 humans ever to die in space. Because space has an actual boundary, it is called the Kármán line, 100 kilometers up. Below it, you are in the atmosphere. Above it, you are in space. The 14 astronauts lost aboard the Challenger and the Columbia were all still inside the atmosphere when they died. Every other spaceflight tragedy in history happened below that line. Only Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev died above it. At 168 kilometers, in space itself. 3 people in more than 60 years of human spaceflight. That is the entire list. They were given a hero's funeral. Their ashes were placed in the Kremlin wall. It was the highest honor the Soviet Union had to give. And then, at that funeral in the middle of the Cold War, something quietly remarkable happened. One of the men who helped carry their remains was an American, the astronaut Thomas Stafford. He was sent in person by President Nixon to walk beside the Soviet cosmonauts and honor their dead. 4 years earlier, a cosmonaut named Vladimir Komarov had been killed on another flight. The United States had offered to send someone to his funeral, and Moscow had said no. This time, Moscow said yes. So for one single moment, 2 nations with nuclear weapons aimed at each other stood side by side. And they carried the ashes of the same 3 men. Because some things are simply bigger than which side of a border you were born on. They were the first crew of the first space station ever built. They set a record that stood for years. And they died on the way home from the greatest achievement of their lives, aboard a machine that did absolutely everything right. So the next time you see a picture of an astronaut sealed inside a bright orange pressure suit, remember why it is there. It is not just equipment. It is a promise, written in 1971. By 3 men who looked like they were only sleeping when the hatch was finally opened. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, Viktor Patsayev. Say their names, they earned it. I will see you in the next one.